Napoleon Bonaparte revolutionized warfare through a series of military innovations that made his army the most formidable force in Europe during the early 19th century. His genius lay not only in his tactical brilliance but also in his ability to reorganize and modernize the structure of his forces, creating an efficient, fast-moving, and highly adaptable military machine. One of his most significant innovations was the corps system, which divided his army into self-sufficient units, each consisting of infantry, cavalry, and artillery. Unlike the rigidly structured armies of his enemies, these corps could operate independently but also coordinate seamlessly with other corps when needed. This granted Napoleon extraordinary flexibility on the battlefield, allowing him to execute rapid maneuvers, concentrate superior force at decisive points, and outmaneuver larger, slower-moving enemy formations. His armies became known for their speed, a characteristic famously referred to as Napoleonic mobility, enabling them to strike with devastating effectiveness before the enemy could fully deploy. Another key innovation was his use of artillery, which he had studied extensively during his early career. Napoleon turned artillery into the backbone of his battlefield strategy, improving its mobility and effectiveness by standardizing the caliber of cannons and training his artillery crews to a higher level of proficiency than those of any other army. Unlike his predecessors, who often dispersed artillery across the battlefield, Napoleon concentrated it into grand batteries that could deliver overwhelming firepower at critical moments. This massed artillery approach was used to break enemy lines, soften up defensive positions, and support infantry in cavalry assaults with devastating barrages. He also placed a strong emphasis on combined arms coordination, ensuring that infantry, cavalry, and artillery worked in unison to maximize their effectiveness. Logistics, often an overlooked aspect of warfare, was another area where Napoleon introduced significant improvements. Traditional European armies relied on long supply chains, which slowed their movements and made them vulnerable to disruption. In contrast, Napoleon implemented a system that allowed his troops to live off the land, sourcing food and supplies locally whenever possible. This minimized logistical constraints and enabled his armies to march faster and sustain longer campaigns without waiting for supply trains. However, this approach was not without risks, as it worked best in fertile regions but could fail when operating in areas with scarce resources, as seen during the ill-fated Russian campaign of 1812. Tactically, Napoleon refined and adapted the use of infantry formations. Instead of relying solely on the rigid line formations used by other European armies, he made extensive use of attack columns, which allowed for rapid movement and shock assaults against enemy positions. Though these columns were vulnerable to concentrated musket and cannon fire, they were highly effective when combined with massed artillery support and flanking maneuvers. Napoleon also deployed light infantry in a skirmishing role, using them to harass enemy lines, gather intelligence, and disrupt opposing formations before a major attack. Cavalry, another critical component of his forces, was employed not only for reconnaissance and flanking attacks but also for decisive charges that could break enemy formations and pursue retreating forces. One of Napoleon's most transformative contributions to military organization was his emphasis on merit-based promotions. Under his leadership, soldiers and officers were rewarded based on skill and performance rather than noble birth, a stark departure from the aristocratic traditions that dominated most European armies. This created a highly motivated and professional officer corps, with many of Napoleon's marshals rising from humble origins to command entire armies. This meritocratic system, combined with the mass conscription introduced during the French Revolution, allowed France to field large, well-trained, and highly disciplined armies. Strategically, Napoleon preferred aggressive, fast-moving campaigns that aimed to annihilate enemy forces before they could regroup or receive reinforcements. His mastery of operational art allowed him to exploit weaknesses in enemy deployments, often forcing adversaries into disadvantageous positions where they had no choice but to fight on his terms. He was particularly skilled at the use of deception, feints, and forced marches to mislead enemy commanders and strike where least expected. The famous Napoleonic strategy often involved engaging and pinning down a portion of the enemy force while maneuvering the bulk of his army to strike a decisive blow at a critical point. This approach was seen in numerous victories, including Austerlitz, 1805, Jena Auerstedt, 1806, and Friedland, 1807, where his ability to outmaneuver and outthink his opponents secured overwhelming triumphs. Ultimately, Napoleon's military innovations reshaped the way wars were fought and set new standards for military organization, strategy, and tactics. His reforms created a model that would influence European and global warfare well into the modern era. His ability to integrate speed, flexibility, firepower, and disciplined coordination made his armies nearly invincible for over a decade, until the combined forces of his enemies eventually adapted to his methods and overcame him through sheer numerical superiority. Even after his defeat, military theorists and commanders across the world studied his campaigns, and many of his principles remain fundamental in military strategy today.